So, hey, welcome to Red May. We surge onward all the way through May and into June. We actually have something on June 5th. I think we started on April 27th. So it's a kind of a 3-month Red May. I've been camping out in this room. What can I say? It's great. I'd like to, let me see. I want to clue you into some things that are coming up. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. Is The Neoliberal City After the Plague with Sam Stein, who wrote Capital City, Gentrification of the Real Estate State, a great book from Verso. He'll be on a panel with a lot of people who do tenants' rights. The ex-mayoral candidate of Seattle, Carrie Moon, should be really good. On Thursday night, we have The Age of Circulation Struggles, which is at 5 p.m. with Joshua Clover, Michael Hart, Glenn Coulthard, Phil Neal, and Nick Estes, and Camilla Vergara. Sarah Jaffe will be the moderator for that one. And I'm leaving something out. I think a Wednesday afternoon, we have, at 1 o'clock, we have The Post-Pandemic Condition, 5 philosophers on the post-pandemic condition. So lots of thought emanating from these Zoom channels, and some more today, but thought is always greased by money. And the money needs to be coming in at a little faster clip here so we can have these kind of insanely large left confabs going on for a whole month next year too. If you go to www.redmayseattle.org and click on donate, we will be eternally grateful. Or you can do it on YouTube, the description of our events, Red May TV. There's a place to click for donate, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can get free real-time CC captioning so we can show these to the differently abled. But now, enough of me. Let's move forward. I want to introduce our moderator today for the panel. Colleen Lai is Associate Professor of English at UC Berkeley, where she teaches courses on 20th and 21st century literature, Marxism and post-colonial theory, and Asian American studies. She has, by the way, been Zooming Capital Volume 1 with Red May alum Chris Nealon for this whole term. And you're working on a book on Asian American Marxism, is that right? In the 60s? Terrific. Well, Colleen, I'll turn it over to you and you can introduce the rest of the panelists.
Hi, thanks, Philip. Really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Red May has made my May. Otherwise, which otherwise would have been sort of depressing as we ended doing Capital Volume 1, but at least there's Red May to take us to the end of this month. Welcome everybody to this panel on Thinking the Pandemic, State and Revolution. I'm wondering whether the Lenin reference here will give us some optimism as we think about the theoretical period in which Lenin, during his exile during World War I, prepared for what was to come next, despite his social distancing or exile in Bern, Switzerland. Our first speaker today will be Andrew Anastasi. He is a student of sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's also an editor and translator of Weapons of Organization, Mario Tronti's Political Revolution in Marxism from Common Notions, and he's on the editorial collective of that fantastic magazine called Viewpoint. I think everyone's going to speak for 10 minutes, and I'll introduce the other speakers after Andrew.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colleen. And thanks to Philip for inviting me to Red May. It's my first one. Very happy to be participating. And thanks also to Jason and Michael for the recent articles and for engaging in this conversation. What I'm about to say relates to a longer piece published last month in Viewpoint magazine. So for anyone who might be interested, you can find it there at viewpointmag.com. In my comments here this evening, I want to try to make 3 points. The first point concerns the capitalist state, which works to reproduce capitalist relations of production. The second point is about ideology, which does not mainly refer to disembodied ideas susceptible to change through argument, but rather to rituals, institutions, and practices. The third point is on anti-capitalist struggle, specifically ideological struggle. And as ideology is embodied in practices, I want to argue that ideological struggle involves experimenting with new forms of organization and collective commitment. Okay, so let's begin with the state. Marx long ago identified the capitalist state and its crucial role ensuring the reproduction of labor power in a capitalist society. He explained why the individual capitalist, driven by competition, is compelled not only to exploit workers, but to continuously increase their exploitation. An individual capitalist does not spontaneously possess or develop a class consciousness that guides his actions and ensures his conduct does not threaten the overall needs of the system. To be sure, at different points in history, there have been particular figures who have demonstrated keen awareness of the needs of capitalist reproduction. But Marx's assumption was that the average capitalist is driven by the pursuit of profit, and that to stay in business, he would sooner work his employees to death than voluntarily implement measures to sustain the bearers of labor power over the long term. If we believe that capitalist society requires the supply of labor power, then it cannot tolerate the annihilation of the workforce with such recklessness in perpetuity. It needs some mechanism of self-defense to guard against this kind of selfish behavior, which may even extend to entire fractions of the capitalist class. This self-defense mechanism does not emerge spontaneously. It largely develops in response to struggles from below, struggles for survival. But in any case, the mechanism we're talking about is what we call the capitalist state. The capitalist state, of course, does not only keep workers alive so that they can keep working and keep enriching capitalists, although this is the outcome of, say, its welfare programs. The state also, as we all well know, kills some bearers of labor power. It also locks up many in cages, separates families from one another by drawing borders, and so on. The capitalist state actually carries out a whole range of political and economic functions which are intertwined. It maintains the social conditions required for overall economic growth and increasing profits. It also fragments and disorganizes the dominated classes by racializing workers, subjecting some to premature death, imposing gendered divisions of labor, and driving everyone to rely on wages and the market to meet their needs. In addition to all of this, the state also unifies capitalists into a capitalist class, or if you want, it organizes the unity of the dominant classes. The state is engaged in all these different activities without being a monolith. We're all aware of the conflicts between state managers and certain capitalists, between different branches and apparatuses of the state, between political representatives in office and those vying for their seats. I'm also intrigued lately by the fracas between the federal government and individual US states, some of which have threatened to form regional clusters in the absence of federal coordination. Maybe this is something we could talk about later. But the coronavirus pandemic has provoked genuine uncertainty, and it seems clear that the capitalist state does not have one answer to the crisis, some sovereign plan it wishes to implement, even if state managers do largely agree on the need to get the population back to work for private industry as soon as possible. A great number of politicians and appointed officials, backed up by a chorus of bourgeois pundits with huge media platforms, are today engaged in a very public discussion about how best to do this. I don't think we should view these conflicts as insignificant, nor am I inclined to adopt the opposite perspective and assume they indicate some terminal collapse of the regime under which we live. Instead, I think we ought to grasp that the coronavirus has prompted distinct proposals and initiatives pertaining to different apparatuses, branches, and strata of the capitalist state. And I think we need to develop our capacity as anti-capitalists to anticipate and exacerbate the contradictions between them, making it as difficult as possible for the power block to maintain its own unity. At the same time, we also need to strengthen the unity of our side, a topic to which I want to return briefly at the end of my remarks. Okay, this brings me to my second point regarding ideology. We have already touched on the fact that the capitalist state comprises a series of apparatuses. These include the army, the police, the courts, the education system, the welfare system, and so on. The French philosopher Louis Althusser separated these into two spheres: the repressive state apparatus, which runs on violence, and the ideological state apparatuses, which of course involve ideology. In a capitalist state, the ideological state apparatuses, what he calls the ISAs, reproduce capitalist ideology, which is the cement of capitalist society. Just think of schools, which teach us, by engaging us in rituals, how to get up on time, how to defer to authority, how to complete assignments in accordance with deadlines. And yet the reproduction of the dominant ideology is not a given. The dominant ideology can be contested through ideological struggle. Ideological struggle is not the same as making an argument. Trying to convince individuals that they hold incorrect beliefs without attending to the collective daily rituals in which they are engaged can only get us so far. Ideology, in other words, refers not merely to a set of ideas. It denotes an imaginary relation to real conditions of existence inscribed in institutions and practices. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. In the current conjuncture, many of the rituals which have traditionally reproduced capitalist ideology in the United States are in crisis. Even before the coronavirus, some rituals that had been associated with the notion of the American dream, like growing up to find a better job than your parents or buying a bigger house than the one you grew up in, these rituals were in decline, unable to be practiced by an increasing number of people. Even before the coronavirus, columnists of the New York Times and Financial Times, CEOs like Jamie Dimon and Mark Benioff, these people were already floating proposals for how contemporary capitalism would need to be modified, whether under compulsion by the state or not, in order to fend off the pitchforks of the masses. Now, under coronavirus, many more rituals have been disrupted. We have a concentrated breakdown of routines. People cannot gather in large groups for barbecues or weddings or funerals or religious services. Sports are canceled and the shops are all closed. You can't go to the polling place to vote. Schools are shuttered. Does anyone know if children are still asked to do the Pledge of Allegiance over Zoom? I'd be curious to know. In any case, the contention I'm making here is that without these rituals, the cement of capitalist society is revealing some cracks. Certain capitalists and state managers want to apply a sealant to fill the gaps. Others believe they can devise a new composite to replace the old cement with something better. I'm suggesting that for our part, we first identify the cracks, many of which people have been studiously chipping away at, and then attempt to use the coronavirus as a jackhammer. The coronavirus has provided countless examples that underline the absurdity of capitalist society. I barely need to recount them. App-based delivery workers, many of them precarious migrants, are sustaining countless households while they themselves lack basic workplace protections and access to healthcare. Precarious adjunct faculty, to take another example, have been putting in extra hours to teach their tenured colleagues how to set up Blackboard accounts, only to be let go by their departments in anticipation of a budget squeeze this fall. And Amazon workers, who we're all tracking, I think, very closely, are being fired for protesting unsafe working conditions at a moment when Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, set to be the world's first trillionaire, reaps record profits from the surge in online consumption. So we could go on like this forever. But this brings me to my third and final point. If ideology is embedded in institutions and practices, then ideological struggle must also concern institutions and practices. In large part, this means building independent organizations, which in an experimental way can nurture practices that reproduce a different ideology, one that contests the dominant capitalist ideology, which tells us that we must go back to normal at all costs. This means that new organizational commitments are necessary, commitments understood in terms of ritual rather than affinity. If we remember that the capitalist does not possess spontaneous capitalist class consciousness, and that capitalist ideology is cohered through the rituals of its apparatuses, we can see that we still need to focus on establishing our own rituals outside of the state and antagonistic to it. Beyond rejecting the existing system and all of its accomplices, we must begin constructing and participating in new forms of working class self-organization. Only these will be capable of unmaking the structures of capitalist domination and weaving new relations that escape the division of mental and manual labor, gender divisions of labor, and other hierarchies. I think I'll stop there because I've gone on long enough, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to discuss.
Thanks, Andrew. Sorry, it's always a slow transition to mute and unmute. Okay, so our next up will be Jason Smith. Jason Smith is currently chair of the Graduate Art MFA program at Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles. His writing and research are largely concerned with contemporary art and aesthetics, modern continental philosophy, and post-68 political thought. He is the author of Smart Machines and Service Work, Automation in an Age of Stagnation, forthcoming soon from Reaction Books. Jason.
There we are. Thanks, Colleen. And I should say thanks, of course, to Philip and to Red May for inviting me. This is my second time, in fact, and I'm really happy to be here with you all. Sorry we couldn't meet in person, of course. Quickly, I'll just try to make a few points about what I was trying to get at in this piece that I wrote and published in the Brooklyn Rail about almost 2 months ago, which is, of course, a lifetime for all of us. And in some sense, that's the point of the essay. At least I was anticipating that being the point of the essay. It was published in the Field Notes section of Brooklyn Rail, which is edited by Paul Maddock Jr. And it's the sort of political section, if you like, of the monthly publication. And so what I was trying to get at in this piece, which is called "Life Comes at You Fast," kind of a cheeky title, I guess, was the sort of coincidence, sort of somewhat surprising coincidence between the de facto end of the Sanders campaign and the onset of the crisis. There was something about that coincidence that was important to me. And of course, I was writing this in the midst of, in real time as this was happening. And so I was trying my best to sort of get a handle. I was actually quite nervous that I would have no idea what I was talking about, because things were happening so quickly and in such a kind of confusing way. But nevertheless, I sort of, I met my deadline and wrote it. The idea behind the title, "Life Comes at You Fast," was that there was something interesting about this coincidence in the sense that, on the one hand, the electoral campaigns are like these very, very sort of, I think I call it something like a plotted drama, right? It's a very, very clear order of events in which the moments of decision, even though you don't know what the decision will be, are sort of mapped out in advance. And you have a very clear idea of when the kind of turning points in the kind of trajectory are going to be, are going to happen. Whereas in some sense, what was powerful about this kind of moment, and I guess it was mid to late March, was that suddenly the plotted drama, as it were, of the electoral campaign was kind of overtaken by a real historical and political crisis, one that's in some sense swept away the whole, sort of spectacle of the Sanders and Democratic Party primary campaign. And that was really important to me because I really felt like there was something telling about that in that moment. Now, in the piece itself, of course, I'm not concerned, well, I shouldn't say of course, because lots of people are concerned with this, but I wasn't concerned with the Sanders campaign itself. I don't have a stake in sort of arguing what went wrong or what went right or what have you. And there's lots of people debating this on the socialist left, as you know. And of course, it's these kinds of discussions are natural in the aftermath of a defeat, like as decisive as the Sanders defeat was. What I was interested in a kind of more parochial way was the way that the socialist left in the US was relating to the campaign and how it described its own kind of understanding of its engagement with the campaign. And one of the things that I noticed in a lot of the writing coming out of, obviously in Jacobin, but also people who are kind of prominent DSA members, sometimes involved with the campaign in a kind of informal way, was that almost everyone spoke of the campaign as somehow related to the idea of a mass movement. And which is interesting for a lot of reasons, which maybe we'll come back to. But this argument took two forms, as far as I could tell. One of them was a kind of more simplistic version of the argument, which is to say that many people understood the campaign itself as a mass movement. And they attributed that to the kind of grassroots dynamism of the campaign and the way that it drew in lots of new people who weren't necessarily politicized in a kind of narrow sense of the term before the campaign and so on and so forth. And that's a kind of very typical sort of way of conceiving of the campaign on the part of many people who were involved, who understood themselves as socialists. The other kind of slightly more sophisticated version of this story was one that understood that the relationship between the campaign and the idea of a mass movement was a kind of, there was a clear distinction between the two, but nevertheless, they related to each other in a kind of typically non-conflictual way. And in fact, sometimes these kind of accounts would characterize the relationship between, say, the electoral campaign and mass movements, or an eventual Sanders presidency and mass movements to come, as being sort of caught in a sort of positive feedback loop. In other words, there was this kind of mutually reinforcing and kind of reanimating dimension between the two. And that was actually something that I really sort of was puzzled over a bit in the article. And I should say that doing the research on this, because I saw it as a kind of study of the socialist left in the US, I noticed that this kind of argument was made in the context of the Corbyn campaign, and particularly once Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party, and is it late 2017 at this point? Can't remember exactly when it was. And also the formation of the organization Momentum, the way in which the discussion on the British left characterized the relationship between mass movements and Corbyn or Corbynism was very similar to what we saw in the US around the Sanders campaign. I should also make a historical footnote and note that in the '84 Jesse Jackson campaign, there's also some similar kinds of descriptions of the relationships between mass movements and electoral campaigns that if anyone's interested, we can talk about. Now, I've already mentioned that this conception of the relationship between this electoral campaigns, or let's say state power, and mass movements is one that depends upon a kind of non-antagonistic relationship between the two. The other thing that's kind of really interesting about the way this was sort of unfolded at the level of discussions around the campaign was that there was a kind of inversion of the usual causality. That is to say that normally and historically, we see reformist governments emerge out of mass movements or responding to the demands made by really powerful mass movements. And that kind of relationship is oftentimes one of a kind of conflictual translation. That is to say that somehow the state apparatus or the government that has the momentary control over the apparatus has to somehow figure out a way to translate those demands into the language of state power. And that can oftentimes take the form of betrayal as much as a kind of faithful translation. And so this itself, the fact that this kind of argument was necessary was itself, for me, symptomatic of the situation of the socialist left since 2016, which in the US has really grown in power and size, well, let's say in size and extent, but did so in a context in which mass movements were almost totally absent in the US context. And this can be contrasted with almost everywhere else in the world. I mean, particularly places like Hong Kong or France, just to give two, or Chile in particular, just to give three examples. And so there's on some level, that question of why the socialist movement in the US has become has expanded in size so dramatically in the absence of mass movements was kind of a question that I was posing and wondering about without necessarily having an answer. The last point I wanted to make was that in the piece, at least, I thought it was really important to make a distinction, a kind of very clear structural distinction between the nature of electoral campaigns and state power and the nature of mass movements themselves. And I wanted to do that in part to insist upon the kind of conflictual nature or the conflictual relationship between them, but also finally, because it seems to me that the defeat of the Sanders campaign, I guess Michigan was the final kind of moment where it was clear that he was going to lose, means that the only option on the table for the socialist left going forward is its relationship to mass movements and throwing itself into mass movements in such a way that it adequately understands what that means. And I think that we're going to see a number of, unpredictably so, a number of really powerful and to some extent self-contradictory movements that are going to emerge in the next months, or let's say the next 3-4 months, to offer a kind of concrete image. So that's what I wanted to get at in the piece. Again, it was written ages ago, but I think it somehow tries to look forward and sort of get us to the place where maybe we are now. So thanks.
Thanks, Jason. Before I introduce our last speaker, I wanted to encourage all of you to formulate your questions, type them in to the live chat, and they could be for any of the individual speakers or addressed to all the speakers, and I will start channeling them back. So please raise your questions for our discussion that will follow Michael Bray. Michael Bray is our third and last speaker. Michael Bray is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Southwestern University. He's the author of Powers of the Mind, Mental and Manual Labor in the Contemporary Political Crisis. And he's recently written on the virus for Spectre magazine, which I really encourage you to read.
Thanks, Colleen. And thanks to Philip and everyone else in Red May who put together this online version so quickly and so well. And thanks to Andrew and Jason. I'm going to try to be as brief and as cogent as they were. We'll see if I succeed. Like them, I'm going to try to talk about at least one kind of through line through this fairly long as well piece that's published on the Spectre website, The Virus Infects Politics. And I hadn't intended to write it as a kind of public essay initially, though that's probably true of most people who've written these pandemic think pieces. I just found myself, I had other things I ought to have been working on, but I found myself sort of in those early weeks constitutively unable to really think about anything else. And so I just ended up kind of writing out some thoughts about the early stages of the pandemic as a way to just try to begin doing something. And so the piece is really marked in a way by some initial reactions to things that were being written early on in those weeks. And sort of just to give some coordinates, I guess, the sort of three things I think that I initially had in mind was one, this kind of move that's largely identified now with Giorgio Agamben, although I also have some Facebook friends who are arguing sort of similar things, but not from the kind of ontological position of Agamben himself, that the lockdown is totalitarian, that this is a kind of seizure of totalitarian power, that I have a Facebook friend who goes on and on at length about how the left is sort of complicit in this and going along with this kind of totalitarian measure. And something about that just seemed to me fundamentally wrong. And so partly here, I'm trying to think through some of that. On the other hand, I was also reading early on a bunch of stuff coming out of people sort of in the ambit or in conversation with social reproduction theory. And as the piece suggests, I in many ways, I think I largely find myself in agreement with those folks. But while they were critical of sort of even the early moves, so they were on the one hand, rejecting this totalitarian kind of reading of social isolation, arguing in favor of it, and criticizing sort of early moves by the US and the UK and other states to sort of pull back or limit the lockdown. But one thing I found myself thinking about is how they didn't really necessarily give a clear account of why states were imposing a lockdown in the first place. So that, because if states, as Andrew mentioned, are in sort of the business of keeping capitalist social relations in place and keeping capital accumulation going, it would seem like, and now we see this quite clearly in some ways, it would seem like that, states could be happy enough to lose 1% to 2% of the population, especially if it's composed mostly of non-productive, retired people and so on. And so I really found myself sort of thinking, how do we think about the fact that universally, except maybe with the exception of Brazil, states are all imposing these lockdowns. And then the last thing, I'm clearly going to struggle to be brief. The last thing was sort of this, I was also found myself thinking about a little suspicious of what seemed to me initially a kind of overly optimistic response to the pandemic in a weird way. Like now, and in a way that reminded me in some ways of the initial aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, that now everything has been revealed and everything will be different from here on out, or must be different. So all of that is sort of at play in a way in these 6 theses I ended up writing. So to try to say something brief about what I actually argued, the thing kind of starts from the premise that there is something relatively novel about the state response to the pandemic, that the kind of general response of states, that that especially, let's say in representative democracies, that the elected kind of representative apparatuses or regimes of these states all took actions that they knew would be that would be in many ways disastrous for capital accumulation. And so that's sort of the initial puzzle that the piece turns on is why do they do this? And what I end up arguing in a sense is that there's a kind of specific form of legitimation crisis at play, I think, that in some ways, I mean, on the one hand, so you have these maybe three factors involved in this. On the one hand, I try to make this case that we shouldn't think so much about biopolitics in the Agambennian fashion as we should think about something like biopolitical economy. And I look at Marx's account of the general law of accumulation in capital there, and to kind of make the case that Marx was already thinking about the way in which capital produced sort of these surplus populations that would decline into pauperism, or at least elements of them would decline into pauperism, and that the state did not need them to live in some sense, except insofar as they operated as this kind of negative pressure on wages and so on. And yet, then I try to argue, especially coming out of post-World War II, coming out of the kinds of struggles of the working class and the kinds of anti-colonial struggles and the pressures of the Cold War, that states over the course of the 20th century ended up taking on this kind of what Tanya Murray Lee calls an obligation to make live, that this becomes sort of this function of the state in actually playing this active role as welfare states or as developmental states in the social reproduction of the broader population, becomes a kind of defining feature of governance that though neoliberal states have in many ways tried to back off from, at the same time they can't depart from them entirely, because to do so would be to lose legitimacy. And so the last piece of this then is that I kind of try to argue that where most states ended up operating is in some form of what Bob Jessup called, speaking about Thatcherism, a two nations hegemonic project, that states try on the one hand to actively sort of gain the allegiance of certain sectors of the population, while through various forms of racialization and marginalization to sort of reduce others to passivity. And then the kind of, how long have I been going on now? And so I'll try to wrap this up relatively briefly. And so then the argument I try to make is that the pandemic produced this kind of dilemma for such states, because insofar as, at least initially, it had to be responded to as, well, actually, sorry, let me take one step back and slow down for 1 second. So the kind of argument I make then is that states trying to carry out this two-nation project within the kind of growing inequality of neoliberal political economies have fallen into a kind of relatively deep legitimation crisis already pre-pandemic. And you see this in things like the decline of voting rates, the broad disinterest in politics, the rise of various kinds of populist parties and figures, the distrust of the traditional parties, and so on. And so when the pandemic comes and it presents, at least it is perceived to present initially, a kind of indeterminate threat to everyone, states felt that they had to step in lest they lose kind of legitimacy entirely. And so they take this kind of stand, in some sense, in favor of life, while at the same time trying, and right now trying even more intensively, to reinstate some form of this two nations hegemonic project, to kind of find the coordinates by which, after having taken this very large kind of broad stand in favor of life making and destructive of capital accumulation, to kind of find the hedge point. Let me see. And so then kind of just very briefly, three other kinds of points I try to make is one, I then try to look at the way in which what we do have, and this is where I am in agreement with many folks who have written about this from a social reproduction standpoint, what we find is that the state, the kind of tension that the state is in with itself, trying to sort of take these lockdown measures, but also to reinstitute certain forms of work and to, you know, get the economy moving again and so on, kind of bring to the fore all of these kinds of fundamental contradictions and tensions that, just in shorthand, maybe we can signal here by like the whole discussion that I think Andrew referred to of essential workers, that in some sense, the very people who had been marginalized and pacified, now the state can't help but in a certain sense heroicizing, but in another sense wanting to make vanish in a way. And I sort of, to some extent, I sort of think of this rush to get people back to work as partly a mechanism to make these essential workers sort of vanish again into a broad field of service workers and bullshit jobs that people all have to kind of go back to. And then very, very briefly, I'll just say that then the essay kind of ends, or at least towards the end, it sort of turns to think about this question of a kind of utopian element of certain readings of the crisis. And I try to think through the fact that, in relation to some of the stuff the other folks were saying, that we still in some important senses live in the world where Corbyn, you know, got crushed by Johnson, and Sanders lost so dramatically on Super Tuesday, especially amongst African Americans in South Carolina, for example. And so I try to make this case that I can say more about later if people are interested. I try to make this case that one thing that's going on there, at least, is a kind of increasing centrality of intellectuals and knowledge workers, professionals, managers to the left since the 1970s, and a kind of divide that has been, or screen, I think I call it, that has been instituted between the kinds of, you know, quasi-utopian or hopeful visions we have and the visions that, or the sort of sense of the difficulty of changing anything that those people who we want to make the bearers of the revolution we envision often take. And so I try to briefly make a case pointing to things like the Black Panther Party's survival program, that perhaps like a more serious turn to actually engaging with the concrete issues of the social reproduction of marginalized, racialized, and other communities could actually be a way to begin to revivify the left. Because the other kind of irony I point to, and I'll end with this, is that, you know, if the state in many ways has lost legitimacy, it's still in some important sense seems to have much more legitimacy than the radical left does for much of the population of countries like the US and the UK. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. Those were 3 wonderful presentations. Maybe I'll start with a kind of synthetic question for the 3 of you, putting together what you all said, or some aspect of what you all said. So Michael, you know, I love your, the line in, I think it was in either the first or second of the parts of the virus infecting politics, in which you say this 2-nation state is afraid of the people, the left must not be, right? And this is kind of what the theme with which you were ending in your talk that you just gave us. And this puts me in mind of, Jason, your point about the weird inversion that you're seeing in the Sanders campaign and the so-called burst of socialism in the United States post-2016, which brings us back to the age-old question of why is there no socialism in the United States, and what does that even mean to pose the question that way, right? So I was wondering whether, you know, for Jason, whether you might want to say more actually about that, that topic, about what your speculation is regarding what seems to be the mainly electoral form that this burst of socialism, or electorally directed form that what's being called socialism after 2016 is taking in the absence of what you call mass movements. You had made allusion to some comparability to the way in which the Jesse Jackson Rainbow Coalition campaign in the 80s had been described similarly, and whether you think that that kind of mainly kind of intellectual cadre, electoral oriented politics that comes at the end of where the new communist movement of the 70s went in the 1980s in terms of its retreat from social movements into a kind of long march through the institutions, whether they were NGOs or universities or electoral politics locally, the Harold Washington campaign, et cetera. That was already a kind of blueprint for what we're seeing post 2016, or is there something different, okay, between the Jesse Jackson campaign, the massness or the radicalness of that campaign versus the Sanders campaign? And then that finally puts me in mind also, Andrew, of your point about needing to build alternative institutions and practices, given that what COVID has opened up is cracks or gaps, and that we need a jackhammer. I'm thinking of like a really broken up sidewalk here. That I love using the coronavirus as a jackhammer to open up those rituals. And of course, that seems very like that's where the Althusserian reading of ideology as a kind of ritual would take us in terms of a kind of anti-capitalist practice. And so my question there to you would be, do you see that, and maybe this comes back to the question too of where do intellectuals and intellectual cadre or knowledge workers stand in relation to mass politics or aspirational mass politics today? Aspirationally, mass anti-capitalist struggles stand, because Andrew, would this alternative institution and practice making, do you think does that need to take place outside the actually existing university, which is now, as we know, as a result of COVID, right, is like potentially in a period of great indeterminacy as to whether we're going to experience an even more extreme shedding post-COVID of labor, increased mass adjunctification, or even a shedding of adjunct labor. What's going to happen? Are we going to return to in-person teaching, or is this a final sort of realization of a techno dream of shoddy online education that will be delivered to international students around the world, so that who might be persuaded to pay top dollar for online educational products? And then can the university be built up from within? What happens to our PhD students who won't get jobs? Do they need to be building alternative institutions? I guess that's a whole set of questions for each of you, but I thought that was there are some linkages there. Anyone could start.
Should I start, or?
Sure, whoever's inspired.
Sure, I'll start. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that this issue is important to me in some ways. I mean, so the quote you read, "The two-nation state is afraid of the people, the left must not be." I mean, part of my thinking there, and I think this is in a lot of the questions you were asking too, Colleen, turns on what I wrote about in my book on the separation of mental labor from manual labor. And what I try to argue there is its kind of increasing centrality to politics over the course of the 20th century. And my concern that in the kind of pre-pandemic world, the radical left was, or at least parts of the radical left, were getting too seduced by a certain kind of vision of, like what Paul Mason calls graduates without a future, and the kind of fact that some knowledge workers were being proletarianized in certain forms, or at least certain forms of office work were being kind of routinized and automated and so on, that there was a tendency to a tendency that I argue in the book has kind of been endemic to the left since the progressive movement or the progressive era, to identify agency with intellectual labor, and to therefore sort of participate unwittingly in a kind of central class antagonism that the right has kind of brilliantly exploited over the course of the neoliberal era, which is this kind of argument that, you know, they think they know better than you. And what I think that we on the left often overlook is the way in which historically knowledge ideas have gained much, you know, they gain their power from elsewhere. They gain their power from other class powers, and that that intellectual labor has become more and more central in kind of designing and programming and managing not only productive apparatuses, but social reproduction as well. And so there's this enormous amount of resentment against mental labor that I think we often don't have a good handle on ourselves, because, you know, we're nice people and we talk to each other and we have interesting things to say. And so I like the way, I'll just end by saying, Colleen, I like the way that you connected to Andrew's question of alternative institutions, because one of the things I'm trying to think about still even a bit in this piece is how do you think about the crafting of kinds of institutional and organizational forms that can advance sort of political and revolutionary causes while directly and kind of systematically undermining the kinds of powers that we as knowledge workers often implicitly assume without realizing it. And I think that we need to find more forms to do that through, or else we're going to continue to have trouble actually drawing the people who we in many ways rightly think should be the kind of revolutionary agents into the kinds of visions that were crafted.
I think people should just jump in without needing to be called on by me. Jason or Andrew, if you feel
Sure,
free.
I can jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah, on this question of mental and manual labor that both Colleen and Michael have now referred to, I know Michael wrote this book. I think that this is one way I would think about answering this question about something like intellectual cadre and their involvement in mass politics. I think that overcoming the division between mental and manual labor has long been a sort of principle of the anti-capitalist left, right? And I think that many times our social movements have not necessarily reflected a kind of ideal overcoming of that. But there's also a rich history of experimentation with different organizational forms, different practices of decision-making, different sharing of roles, and the sort of transposing of tactics and strategy and who gets to make those decisions or calls. And so I think that one of the things, maybe this gets a little bit to Jason's discussion of mass politics, I'd be curious to hear what he has to say on this point, is that to a certain extent, even if counter institutions, which I referred to, I think we need counter institutions. We need independent autonomous organizations outside and opposed to the state that have their own longevity, that have their own institutional of activity that is not sanctioned by say public sector university official work, for example. But at the same time, I think that there is an element of surprise when these mass movements kick off, and I think that part of what we need to do in this interim, I don't know if we're really in an interim, I don't know what to call it, but is devote ourselves, those of us who see ourselves as partisans of the left, those of us who have been kind of activated and enraptured by something we could call the communist idea, dedicate ourselves to developing infrastructure and institutions in this interim, because that won't be enough. That will not be the absolute kind of totality of what can emerge with a movement, with a mass movement. We're always surprised by the forms it takes and the experiments it throws up. But I do think that it's one way of kind of getting our ducks in a row and preparing ourselves to play a role, whether it is as, if we happen to be knowledge workers in the university, how can we share our sort of research skills and draw on, the different capacities and venues we have for writing in service of a movement. So I guess I'll stop there.
Well, let me circle back to Colleen's questions, and then maybe I'll be able to come back to some of these questions, or we can all discuss it. The first thing, the question of the relationship to the Jackson campaign in '84 is a really interesting one for me, because in a way that there's a really stark difference between the Sanders campaign and the Jackson campaign, in the sense that those people who came out of the social movements of the 60s and 70s and migrated into electoral politics, and who oftentimes thought of what they were doing as continuing in some sense those movements after their winding down or decomposition or whatever you want to call them in the late 70s, they came from a very different place politically. They were oftentimes much older. They'd spent 15, 20 years, maybe in some cases, involved in social movements. They had an enormous wealth of experience. They also had a kind of theoretical sophistication and kind of historical sophistication that simply wasn't the case for most of the people who were oftentimes relatively new to so-called socialism and who kind of threw themselves into the Sanders campaign. So there's a kind of interesting historical echo, but there's also something totally kind of backwards about the way the relationship between those two moments. And I think that, there's a really important, I think there's a couple essays, but one important essay by Robert Brenner that I cite in the piece that I wrote that sort of describes his own understanding or his own analysis of the Jackson campaign, in particular, those people who came from the social movements and who still described their own activity in the campaign as a continuation of those, or as being in some sense a continuity between those movements and the campaign. And I thought that was really important for me to kind of think through what I was trying to get at as well. I mean, the question of why the socialist movement in the US, which is still, I mean, of course, a tiny fraction of the 350 million people that live there, why it's grown so dramatically. I mean, on the one hand, but also why it's sort of so identified with a kind of electoral vision of politics. Although I'm sure many would doubt or would offer, contrary perspectives. That's a good question. I mean, clearly, Sanders is a kind of a opportunity. I mean, he's kind of a unique candidate in a lot of ways. And he was there. And to some extent, it was the only game in town, right? If there's an absence of mass movements in the US, inexplicably in some sense, then that's where you go. That's where the game is being played. There's another question, though, about like the social composition of the socialist left. And I think that, it's primarily at this point incredibly young, like maybe even like under 30 years old, probably on average, or maybe under 35, something like that. Relatively new to politics. And it also probably comes primarily from a kind of class background that predisposes it to think of politics in terms of an electoral sort of sequence or electoral framework. That is to say that many people in the US, and for very good reason, they probably had very good reasons, do not vote at all. I think you're talking about maybe half the eligible population don't vote. And they don't vote for a reason. And sometimes those reasons are articulated, sometimes they're not. But that has to be sort of somehow thought, and many of them, of course, are probably more, for the majority of them are working class voters. So that has to be somehow brought into a kind of sociological, if you like, explanation for this kind of disconnection between the kind of adherence to an electoral vision on the one hand and a kind of abstentionism, if you like, a kind of mass abstentionism on the part of working class voters who don't vote. So those, I don't know if that answers the question, but those are the kinds of things I was thinking about as you were asking the question. It's like, well, maybe those are some ways to think about why things have unfolded the way they have. So, and as far as in the case of Andrew's question, I mean, of course, I agree abstractly with what you say, that there has to be a kind of framework in which people are able to anticipate, if you like, organizationally, theoretically, mass movements that might or might not unfold, but they're always going to be, as you say, a kind of unexpected. Certainly the timing, but also the content of the movements are almost always going to totally derail your best laid schemes as a kind of person who identifies as a kind of leftist, sort of intellectual or something like that. And that has to be sort of incorporated into those institutions that you're describing, I think. And so that's on the one hand, that's one way to think about it. The other thing is simply that on some basic level, one has to be ready to throw oneself into the movements as a participant and not as an intellectual, if that makes sense. Because the movement itself will generate its own understanding, its own theory of itself. And of course, sometimes it's inadequate, sometimes it's incoherent, and one can somehow intervene in that way if it feels relevant. But I do think that that's also an important thing to always sort of assume that mass movements are not, they're intelligent, and they produce their own understanding of history, of strategy, and of their own situation and struggle. And that on some level, the duty of someone who thinks of themselves as on the left is to somehow try to understand and to try to, in some sense, articulate in maybe a different way that intelligence, that kind of, I don't want to say spontaneous, but I want to say kind of self-produced intelligence. So I don't know if that answers the question, because it's a little too abstract to talk like that, but we are talking about movements that aren't here yet. So.
Actually, there are some questions that appeared in the chat that kind of follow on from this last line of discussion quite nicely. The first question is, what would it look like to organize the gap between Jason's and Andrew's positions presented? Can the pandemic conditions be leveraged to concretize new class and proletarian rituals as a mass movement? In a way, I feel like, Jason, you were kind of speaking to that. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, to what you just said, as prompted by the formulation of this question, and also whether, Andrew, you have some thoughts in response to that question. Yeah, but let me actually read, while you think about that, I'm going to read question 2 as well, because it's kind of, in a way, follows on from that. So question 2 is for Jason. And this is kind of a compressed version of question 2, so because it took up 6 long chat boxes. So apologies to the questioner if this is a violent compression. Jason, this is about your Brooklyn Rail piece. Could you speak more about this one line in that piece? Quote, social movement strategic and theoretical poverty is compensated for by extraordinary innovations and tactics, which easily spread across geographic distance and national or cultural divisions, end quote. What exactly did you have in mind? My understanding is that events like communes, wildcat strikes, boycotts, etc., are real subjective leaps. Was, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott not a rich vehicle of self-development?
Maybe I can quickly answer that one. I had in mind, the post-2008 sequence, probably. And I was thinking in particular the so-called squares movement, where you had this kind of very, very quick, kind of sudden invention of a new tactical form, which is the occupation of a kind of public square, Tahrir Square, in particular in Egypt, being the kind of the sort of lodestar or something like that of the global movement. And that form quickly sort of moved around the globe quite in a way that is hard to understand on some level, but certainly in Spain in particular, in Greece, and of course the US. And so I thought that's what I meant by kind of the theoretical or the tactical richness, that movements are always, because they're involved in kind of struggle, and struggle being understood as a kind of day-to-day relation of, variable relation of force, they're constantly operating in kind of innovative tactical ways. But at the same time, even though, of course, I just described the intelligence of the movements, because I do think there's a kind of intelligence that's strategic as well. I think that oftentimes movements have a difficult time articulating strategic perspectives, if that makes sense. A strategic kind of framework that would allow it to transcend its own limits, if I can put it in those terms. And I think that's what I was trying to say by that line, if I remember the line at all. So yeah, maybe that's what I was trying to say. That's the example. Is the square form was a tactic that was essentially invented, although there are examples historically of people doing similar things, but it was invented in Cairo, and everyone was doing it, months later. And that was a kind of brilliant episode in the last kind of the last crisis, the post-crisis period. So that's sort of what I meant by that. So maybe Andrew has some thoughts on the previous question.
Sure. I mean, one thing I would say is that, I suppose when we're talking about the question of organization, we haven't yet talked about mass organization. So are we talking about organizations in a minority sense, in a vanguard sense? There's a lot of different dimensions that we could take. But perhaps if we were thinking about organization in the terms of a combination of individuals who are both already perhaps politicized in a particular direction, and individuals who have a shared set of whether local circumstances or a workplace, and some sort of fusion of the two, of kind of political, maybe a strategic horizon, to use to refer to something Jason was just gesturing towards, as well as a tactical capacity for invention on a very local level. This is the kind of thing that I think we could imagine in terms of organization, and part of that would, I think, involve not only close and frequent communication between members of such an organization, but also some sort of capacity to coordinate nationally and internationally, and be able to shift depending on circumstances. So depending on these unpredictable mass movements, which may erupt around particularly salient issues at some time that couldn't have been foreseen, organizations would need to be able to nimbly adjust to this and react in quick time frame. I think it's easier, this is very awkward and abstract language. It's easier to think about what we might not want to counsel one another to be working on. And that's something that I think Michael referred to in his piece as the apprenticeships for a new breed of state architects. And I think that this is a problem on the left, such as is in the United States right now, is seeing the horizon as participating in government, as a new activist stratum within the capitalist state. I think that this is a different conception of political activity than the one that I'm trying to propose with regard to organizations. I don't know if Michael wanted to say anything or add anything on those points.
I mean, I guess I would just say, because I agree with much of what you both said. I guess the thing that I still struggle with, and maybe you all have thoughts to help me with, is sort of the inverse side of that worry about left theory turning into some kind of apprenticeship for a new breed of state activists. I wonder if we're not sometimes tempted to make like plans for organizations for people who don't yet want to be part of such organizations. And I really don't want to undercut the reality of real struggles happening, both the kind of Occupy movements that Justin talked to, and teacher strikes, and these strikes that have been breaking out of workers insisting on sort of PPE and other kinds of things. I think all of this is really important, but I'm still kind of haunted by this sense of like, whether they're, when Lenin or Gramsci or someone talks about the working class, I feel like they know what they mean in a more concrete sense, right? There's this kind of existence of a political composition of industrial workers. They have this kind of sense of things. At least there are kind of cells of this. And I sometimes, I'm still kind of haunted by an ex-student of mine who's doing some work with an organization doing sort of food programs and other things in downtown Philadelphia. just posted yesterday something like that what he finds so funny about a certain breed of like white leftist is when they romanticize the people living in, in his terms, the quote, he put it in quotes, the hood. And he says like they don't want to be revolutionaries, they want to be entrepreneurs. And he wasn't making that point to say like, and therefore we should just abandon them, or therefore there's no hope for their development towards kind of some forms of organization and revolutionary politics, but that there's this potential gap where we have, and maybe I'm overstating this, where we have this kind of lack of a political composition of a working class, and then I guess I'm just trying to say like I have this trouble thinking of exactly what a mass organization looks like today, because as exciting as the Occupy movements were, like sociological studies tend to suggest that they were sort of leaned in their composition towards something like the children of the same kind of folks who Justin pointed out are part of the Sanders campaign, like young people who come from a class background that predisposes them towards an electoral vision of politics. And so I don't know, I might be rambling on a bit. Hopefully that made some sense.
Well, one thing I wanted to point out, I have a question for you, Michael, that maybe we can get back to, but just an immediate response is that the question of the composition of the working class, how does one understand that today? I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating to me about what's happened in the last 2 months is the way in which the term essential worker became so kind of self-evident to apparently everyone. We use it all the time. Apparently the political class arrived at it very, very quickly. I have no idea how they did that. I've done no research on this at all, but the few kind of probes I've made suggest that the term was very much in use during World War II, in fact. And those essential workers were people who oftentimes were farm workers, for example, who were exempted from military duty, so they wouldn't be called up, to fight in wherever they were supposed to fight, but rather would stay on the farm and do what is necessary to produce for the wartime tables of the American population. And of course, these existed in Britain, Germany, and elsewhere. So that's one question. But what's interesting is that you have this kind of strange division between people who maybe thought of themselves as public sector workers or private sector workers, people who thought of themselves as mental versus manual laborers, people who thought of themselves as being in the service sector versus the manufacturing sector. That division becomes not attenuated necessarily, but nevertheless less, let's say, overdetermined by this distinction between, on the one hand, people who are professional white-collar workers who have had very little trouble transitioning online, and their work is not threatened, their pay is not threatened for the most part. There's a large group of people who were deemed essential workers who were essentially forced to go to work under absolutely untenable conditions. And then there's a bunch of people who were forced not to work because they were deemed inessential. And that's really the composition of the working class on some, the people who earn wages to somehow reproduce their existence. That's who those people are. In some way, that's a really fascinating reshuffling of the kind of layers of the class. And in part, it's interesting to me because it's clear that what's going to happen at some point, I imagine, I don't know if it's clear, is that you're going to have people who are essential workers who refuse to go to work. And that's already happening in places like meatpacking plants. And then you're going to have non-essential workers who are going to actually, demand access to wage labor again, because they're not going to be getting income from the state. They're not going to get support from anywhere else. Unemployment insurance is going to run out, or it's going to be inadequate. They've got rent, they've got whatever. And so you're going to have this kind of strange kind of conflictual sort of situation in which the class itself is split along those lines. And so anyway, I thought that it was an interesting thing to think about, is like, why is it that the term essential worker becomes so self-evident to essentially everyone? And we say it amongst ourselves as if we know what it means. So, I mean, it also, one last point is that it's interesting. The implication is that there are people who are inessential workers, and that they're laboring activities which are inessential. And that's also kind of an interesting thing to hold on to when thinking about how we think about what work might look like in 6 months or a year or what have you. So just a kind of thought.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I'll just say the thing, I like that way you sketch that out as a kind of composition of the working class. And this is what I find really interesting and what I try to think through in some of the essay, drawing on folks like Titi Bhattacharya and Sue Ferguson and other people working in the social reproduction theory position, that in some ways it seems right to me that what came so quickly to be called essential workers is really workers who are doing work central to sort of the social reproduction of populations. And I think that there is something really interesting and potentially promising about the way in which that is being brought directly into the kind of consciousness and experience of both the people doing that work and broader populations, that itself could have a number of interesting and potentially productive effects in sort of thinking through an anti-capitalist position from this perspective of sort of, as Bhattacharya and Ferguson put it, like life-making versus profit. And so I do think that, and in a weird way, it's that same need for social reproduction that would lead non-essential workers to be pressing to go back to work, insofar as the wage is their only means of gaining access to commodities and so on. And so I do think there's something really, if I sounded the pessimistic note before, like I do think there's something potentially productive here if it finds ways to develop in this kind of conscious recognition of social reproductive labor as like the thing that human societies are really founded and dependent on.
Can I push on something there, connecting or maybe distinguishing Michael and Jason's ways of approaching what used to be called this baggy service sector? Now somehow like cut up, but also I don't know, selectively foregrounded in a certain way by the figure of the essential worker in COVID. And here I'm thinking of, you know, Jason, your piece in Automation, Nowhere to Go, where you so usefully talk about how the service sector is this really baggy monster of all kinds of work, but that it's useful to think of some segment of it as externalized manufacturing labor, right? Whether we're talking about what you mentioned, that it's either like say designers or people involved in trucking and shipping. And so that seems to suggest there's a way to think about service labor, because the perennial question has been, how do you organize service workers? They're isolated, they're dispersed, they're not concentrated on the shop floor. How do you do workers' inquiries, and how do you even do a wildcat strike with service workers? So if we're beginning from there, on the one hand, we're rethinking some segment of service workers as actually former manufacturers, but under a different name, under the new sort of logistics, right? Global chain, you know, organization. But then on the other hand, with Michael, your way into this is to sort of think about the social reproductive worker, wherein what is actually itself, okay, I mean, I love Titi Bhattacharya, but also when you teach, when one teaches how not to skip class, and it's very inspiring that she brings together, you know, something like this Chicago school teacher strike as being successful precisely because they managed to unify productive and social reproductive labor by getting parents of their kids that they're teaching to identify with what might seem to be a productive struggle that isn't then pitted against their own interests. And that is a way in which that you can rally community support for the teacher strike. Okay, but that's a kind of way in which we're thinking we want to unify, you know, productive and reproductive labor, which seems a bit different from your suggestion in your piece in Spectre, where the essential worker is a kind of social reproductive worker, but not actually all kinds of social reproductive workers, actually, because as you beautifully say, riffing on Marx, that the blessing and curse of that social reproductive work of the essential worker is that double freedom to work in a pandemic, the freedom to choose one's job while freed from the means to stay at home. So it's precisely the essential workers who are service workers, who are, say, retail store workers, supermarket workers, delivery workers, but not the housewife, right? Who can stay at home, maybe who had always stayed at home because she was supported to stay at home, or the middle-class professional parent who might have been doing a double shift already, but can continue to be paid because she is a tech worker and can telecommute, or she's a professor who will still get paid, but now is subject to a triple shift, not just a double shift, because her kids have to be educated at home. But at least she's not one of those who has to go out and be an essential worker. So I guess I'm partly trying to think through like what's an essential worker via your way of going at it via a certain segment of the social reproductive worker versus Jason's way, maybe when you were disaggregating in that piece, you know, the service worker, which is that hard to organize baggy class via, you know, say the externalized manufacturing laborers.
Well, I'll make a quick remark here. These are really interesting and complicated questions. I mean, the one thing about this, the teachers' strike also, but there was a large one in LAUSD, I believe it was a little over a year ago. And what's so remarkable about it is the scale at which the strike takes place, right? Because it's an entire school district. In Los Angeles, it's like 600,000 children, I think, or something like that, were somehow affected, and all their families were affected as well. And what's fascinating about the teachers' strike is that even though these are, you know, it's in the public sector, and the type of the conditions, the social relations in which these kinds of activities, teaching activities, are being performed are quite different than, say, someone working in the private sector in manufacturing and so on and so forth. It's located at a very sensitive point in the social division of labor, such that when teachers go on strike, parents are indirectly forced to not go to work so that they can take care of their children and so on and so forth, right? And so it has this kind of very special place within the broader social division of labor that has nothing really to do with the distinctions between, say, productive and unproductive labor, private or public sector, service, manufacturing, and so on and so forth. Regarding the question of the service sector and why it seems to be hard to organize, I mean, a lot of people pointed out the fact, as you say, that the workplaces tend to be quite small, and that across different kinds of service activities, there's very, very little continuity. So for example, in manufacturing, the types of activities that workers are doing in an automotive plant and in a meatpacking plant are much more similar than those who are, for example, I don't know, like cutting hair in a salon over here, but then delivering packages over there, right? They're totally different kinds of activities. And so there's a kind of disjunction that's kind of implicit there. There's also the fact that oftentimes service activities are labor intensive. So there's very little capital that's being mobilized by their laboring activity. And so the effect of a work stoppage, for example, it's going to be diminished greatly relative to what can happen at, for example, a large factory somewhere and that sort of thing. Nevertheless, of course, there are people like Kim Moody, for example, who tend to think of people like people working in Amazon warehouses or people delivering packages as being part of an extended manufacturing process. And he makes various arguments about why that's the case, which are arguable, but nevertheless, it's an interesting argument to sort of work on, I think. It's like, because I think that almost everyone agrees that the way that the labor force is, or the labor market, if you like, is divided between manufacturing and service sector is completely incoherent. And yet we all take it for granted as kind of self-evident. And there's a million different ways to sort of rethink that in some sense. And it's also the case that, as you point out, or you allude to, much of what we call service sector activity now are simply activities that were once done in manufacturing firms, but which have been outsourced to firms which specialize in service activities. So for example, it might have been the case that accounting was done in-house by a big manufacturing firm, but now instead of having in-house accountants, they actually outsource that to an accounting firm. And so those same workers are now called business services rather than manufacturing services. So in any case, I just thought I would sort of elaborate that. I mean, this is a very, I wrote a whole chapter on this in this book that you mentioned that's coming out, and it's something that's really, I've worked on quite a bit, and it's a very important question, I think, so.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that that's a set of complex issues. One thought, and a great question, one thought I had, something I was actually just working on earlier today, although in a way maybe it's alluded to, or maybe I was already beginning to think about this in this essay, is that, you know, you called, and I like this term, the service sector a baggy monster. I've been starting to wonder, and this might take away some of the optimistic tone I was trying to strike in my last piece. I'm beginning to wonder a bit if social reproduction isn't a baggy monster too, because, so I think I say in this essay somewhere that, you know, yes, there's a sense in which the pandemic shows that we all have an interest in survival and in living, but that both connects us and brings us into tension, because when people are seeking, when we as individuals or as groups are sort of seeking to reproduce ourselves and to make our lives and to live well, we're not simply doing that in some kind of pure abstract way where we're all involved in the same abstract form of life making. We're also in some sense trying to reproduce our social position, right, or to improve it. And so if you have a society that's composed in sort of antagonistic hierarchical ways, and you have, you know, a population involved in acts of social reproduction, then there might actually be enormous antagonisms and tensions between those acts of social reproduction. So you know, I've been developing this kind of notion of populisms as social reproduction struggles. And one of the things I've been trying to think through is whether, you know, in some sense, right-wing populisms aren't this too. It's just that the thing they're trying to reproduce is white supremacy. Which has implicitly defined this core of kinds of sets of social positions and so on. And so yeah, I definitely agree that there are enormous differences ultimately in the kinds of what social reproduction work looks like for different people, what the goals of social reproduction are. And I think this, you know, in some ways this does sort of, where it might look at certain moments, and in a piece like Bhattacharya's at certain moments, like social reproduction becomes the basis for this integrative vision of the working class. It might actually be that it just throws us back again in a kind of new and informed context on kinds of issues of class division and thinking about class formation in some of the same ways and the same kinds of dilemmas that we've been thinking about for a long time.
I'd actually like to bring Andrew in and ask him whether he has any thoughts on this line of discussion, also because there's a question for Andrew in the chat from the audience, which kind of connects to this, and this has to do in a way with culture, political culture. The question is for Andrew, but also works for everyone, what can new forms of working class self-organization look like in isolation? Are there possibilities for harnessing state capacities in this time to push capital's contradictions through this conjuncture? I know I've temporalized this question. That's still the questioner. And this particular questioner is thinking of your piece on Tronti's autonomy of the political. I'm going to roll onto another question, which I think connects to that as well, so we can take them as a group. How do we make sure that the countercultures we develop have political purchase and don't remain lifestyle choices tolerable to and recuperable by capital? And then the fifth question, plenty of people hate being in communist and socialist organizations because of their dynamics. Plenty of people hate being in any kind of ordered social and political organization. So question, should we be worried currently about making organizations for mass movements, or should we be pushing more compositional approaches that coordinate variegated interests among different social compositions? So they seem kind of related, those questions.
Great. I don't know if I can answer all of those, but I guess I'll try to ramble something together and see what happens. One thing just that came up earlier that I think needed to be maybe clarified is the way that we were discussing, or the way that it kind of came up, the discussion of anti-capitalist organization, and then particular sectors of the working class that may or may not be engaged in overtly political struggle at the moment or something like that. I just wanted to say that, of course, anti-capitalist organizations exist among different sectors of the working class. Some are small, many couch what public pronouncements they make in very careful language, perhaps to ensure that they continue getting funding if they're enmeshed in that kind of relationship. But they exist across the country, right? And so it's not only a question of intellectuals injecting something like socialism from without into sort of purely working class mass, situations. And what's more is, the question of college and universities has come up a couple of times. And I think, it's probably clear to most of us here, but it's worth emphasizing that, going to college is not an activity that is only engaged in by people of the middle and upper classes, nor does it catapult people out of the working class necessarily. I work at CUNY, which has 275,000 students. And this is a massive place where people who are, who are of the working class spend a lot of their time. So I think that, we can't have a sort of clean distinction between struggles that may come out of university settings or traverse different colleges or university settings and these sort of autonomous independent activities. And I think that, this gets to the question of kind of harnessing state capacities. I don't know if I can answer it with that language, but I think that, a different way of thinking about this problem of ideological struggle is struggle within and against the ISAs, right? So whereas I do think that there's a need for independent autonomous organization, I also think that, as many people have noted, that can start to sound like something like a counterculture lifestyle choice, closed off and what's the word? What's the phrase from John Holloway? Change the world without taking power. So that's not something I'm suggesting either. And I think that many autonomous forms are able to have a bearing upon these existing apparatuses. What is required is some foot outside of them, right? What is required is some sort of independent constitutional form, and whether that's permanent or more temporary, I think we can leave up to different circumstances. But I think that this idea of being kind of within and outside the state is not one that is so clear. I think that it's one in terms of operations. So I don't know if I'm able to kind of combine any more thoughts on these questions. The question of compositional approaches, I think that's really important. I think an ecosystem of movement organizations is something that we should take seriously. The question of organization used to be the problem of the party as a sort of articulating and binding element of different struggles. And I think that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we have something like the party, certainly not in the United States right now. And so I think that the existing struggles, the existing compositions do suggest that some sort of compositional approach, some sort of ecosystem approach is important. Nevertheless, there needs to be communication and coordination. Whether that needs to be done by some sort of sovereign entity, I don't think so. But I think that without organizational forms, it's hard to kind of knit things together. At least that's what I'm trying to suggest.
Michael or Jason, did you feel moved to say anything in response to those suite of questions?
I'm trying to track down the suite of questions.
I could restate, or do you want me to restate?
Yeah, really, really quickly, if you don't mind. I tried to write them down, but I can't understand what I've written down.
Sure. Shoot.
There was something about the devolution of autonomous organizations into kind of countercultural sort of, I don't know.
What can new forms of working class self-organization look like in isolation? Are there possibilities of harnessing state capacities in this time to push capital's contradictions through this conjuncture? how do we make sure that was one question.
Yeah,
and
okay.
the question was, how do we make sure the countercultures we develop have political purchase and don't simply remain lifestyle choices that are recuperable by capital? But also, should we be worried currently about making organizations for mass movements, or should we be pushing more compositional approaches that coordinate variegated interests among different social compositions?
I see, yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, for me on some level, I don't know if this is just like a personal tick or something like that, but I really think it's important that people who sort of see themselves on the left, and I'm increasingly not sure I know what that means, or whether I belong there. I think it's really important to just to renounce organizing themselves as leftists in some separation from any existing kind of struggle that's is or isn't unfolding. I think it's really, really important, of course, for people to do work during periods of kind of latency or otherwise kind of inactivity, things when things don't seem clear in terms of which way struggles or where struggles might erupt or which way struggles might go. I think that there's a lot of theoretical work and historical work that people can do. I think there's also, you know, informal networks. I think publications are important also, and that's something that we really lack on the American left. Vibrant, interesting, theoretically informed publications. But I think it's really important for people who see themselves as intellectuals or who are seen as intellectuals to, in some sense, I don't know if this is the ideological struggle that Andrew was pointing to. It's kind of somehow negate their own position as intellectuals and as leftists even, and try to really, really study and be as close as possible to what's actually unfolding socially. And I don't know I mean, that's a kind of modesty on the one hand, but it's also a kind of a recognition that one doesn't know where things are. We don't know where we are right now. And that's the thing that I've really been grappling with. And I have nothing to say to an essential worker who's being forced to go into a meatpacking plant. I can't tell them whether to refuse to work or to work. I can't tell them whether they should shut down the entire economy or whether they should try to feed their families as best they know how. I want to know what they think, and I want to know how they're going to deal with this situation. And I think they're already dealing with this situation, responding to the situation. And I think at the very least, maybe that's what the responsibility or the mandate of people who are kind of in the sort of division, the leftist division of labor. That's what the mental workers or whatever they're called, mental laborers should be doing. So that's sort of, I don't know if that's answering the question, but that's kind of like my way of thinking about these things right now. So, which is not to say that I don't think a kind of national or even international organization that somehow not only coordinated, but even directed, even had the pretense of directing struggles theoretically is off the table. I think anything's possible. And I wouldn't bar such a party, if you like, from being relevant in struggles that might come in the next, 1 to 5 years. To the contrary. So it's not an ideological, or it's not an orthodox position that I have, or dogmatic position I have. It's just where I think things are now, given where we are. So.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of thoughts, mainly in relation to what other folks have said. I mean, I do think that in terms of organizational forms, as I try to say in the essay, I think that, the social reproduction of marginalized communities, sort of quote unquote surplus populations, in the spirit of the Black Panther Party's survival pending revolution, could be one model for part of this. And interestingly, the Black Panther Party comes out of Oakland Community College, I believe it was, and so is a kind of example as well of what Andrew was pointing to in terms of how we have to think more complexly about exactly what in the post-war era college and increasingly so what college means. And to pick up on something else Andrew said at the beginning, I do also think that it's not exactly harnessing state capacities in the terms of the question, but I do think that I say something like in the essay, what Andrew said in his presentation, that like it is really important, and it is a role that perhaps leftist intellectuals can play to try to keep the power block fragmented. I think one of the things I refer to in the essay is like Gramsci's idea that you have to draw as many moderate intellectuals, as many traditional intellectuals over to your position as possible, precisely to sort of fragment the kind of ideological position that the power bloc is constructing. And also that, in terms of thinking about things like the Black Panther Party, also in terms of just fragmenting the kind of mobilization of state powers to destroy these kinds of experimental organizational forms early on, because I too don't think we can just ignore the state, because if you don't want anything to do with the state, then the state wants something to do with you. And so we do also have to think about, even to the extent we're trying to think of something like autonomous forms, or kind of breaking away from the state into something like an organization of the social reproduction of communities, you do still have to think about a strategy for various forms, including perhaps electoral forms, of kind of fragmenting the state and producing a kind of regime that isn't necessarily going to actively and violently destroy experimental alternatives in organization in their very infancy and development.
Andrew, I want to direct your attention to a question from Philip, actually. It's in the chat, but I'll read it out so other people can hear it. Andrew, what do you make of the fact that it's the West Coast governors who are enacting the collective capitalist role, while the predatory executive and his cronies embody the short-sighted behavior that the collective capitalist is supposed to rein in?
It's a great question. I mean, I find it fascinating. And I think that it shows on one level what I was trying to point to earlier is the lack of coordination within different apparatuses and branches of the state, right? It would be incorrect at this point, and I think Trump has disabused almost everybody of this notion that there's some sort of unified plan according to which things make sense within all of the different branches of the state, as if they were coordinated in the way that perhaps we are aspiring to do outside of the state, or in some alternative antagonistic way to it. I think that it's too soon to tell whether something like the collective capitalist proposals coming out of the West Coast Federation of Governors is going to, be rolled out, be enacted, be able to shepherd forward increased accumulation in the face of something like a failed Trump policy, or a failed policy by certain states to open too early. With the second wave of infections, perhaps the attack on the accumulation process will be even deeper and more severe. So I think it's an important question, and I think that in different periods of crisis, economic, political, and otherwise, we do see these sort of far-seeing intellectuals of capital. Keynes, of course, being one of the classic examples. I think it would be an error to expect that in all cases there's some sort of corporate state that is able to kind of take all of this into account and plot out a long-term strategy for continued growth at the same time, as Michael kept referring to, its legitimation function coming into play. But I do think that it's something that, going into this autumn, we should keep our eyes on. And it is a kind of division within the forces that make up the capitalist power bloc right now that, if we can exacerbate it, I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think that is, that's something to strive for.
Maybe I could say one quick thing about that. I mean, one of the things that just as a kind of follow-up to what you've been saying, I mean, what's amazing to me is, and I should say, first of all, that, Michael's formulation of the fundamental question that I've been asking myself is really kind of remarkable. I mean, the idea that with the exception of a few governments, Brazil, Sweden, Britain and Italy had this kind of herd immunity strategy. The fact that all the rich countries of the world decided sort of spontaneously to to shut down their economies, knowing full well the kind of catastrophic consequences of doing so, is just absolutely remarkable to me. And I still haven't quite understood. I mean, Michael's response to that question is as good as any I've read. There's also the question, as Andrew points out, of kind of the lack of kind of state capacity that's been on display, particularly in the US, particularly at the national level, of course. And what's fascinating to me is to think about that in the context of another dimension of state capacity, which is that the response, not only to shut down the economy, but to actually fund the shutdown, as it were, was taken immediately in the course of a few days without any deliberation publicly that I know of. And what we ended up with was $2.3 trillion that the Fed sort of pumped into the economy to keep the financial system going. And we also ended up with a $2 trillion stimulus package in the matter of days. I don't know how, maybe it was a couple of weeks for the stimulus package. That's $4-point-something trillion that the state was able to, across party lines, whatever that would mean in America right now, in the US right now. And so that's also something that has to be thought of in the context of this massive incompetence at the level of the kind of healthcare system in the US, and also the political capacity to simply organize a national response in combination with this, again, totally remarkable kind of fiscal and monetary response of the US government. It's just totally unbelievable to me. And I don't understand how it's possible that this could have happened. And essentially, these decisions were probably made by a group of like 20 people. It wasn't as if the House of Representatives, there were these long, complex debates about whether or not we should do this or that, right? And so maybe Jay Powell alone is just writing, sort of authorizing everything. I don't know, but I just wanted to point that out as a kind of, not a contradiction, but as a kind of weird way in which state capacity is both totally disabled and yet highly precise and able when it comes to certain aspects of responding to the crisis.
Sorry, Andrew, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, not to bring a whole other thing onto the table, but it should always be in the front of our minds is the climate catastrophe and how, the state's response to this crisis does or does not relate to that. One thing also I'm thinking about in terms of the collective capitalist is, environmental regulations. The Trump administration and its various, agencies has rolled back many of these restrictions that, went in under the Obama administration and before. And one of the things I found particularly fascinating was, I think it was over the summer, they rolled back the regulations on methane production. And firms were now legally able to leak much more methane into the air when they were extracting it. And this was something that actually provoked cries of outrage by some of the largest energy corporations, and something that was greeted with, great happiness, great excitement from much smaller energy firms. And so the big agency, the big organizations, the big corporations were upset that the spur to innovation was being lost. So I think that when we ask ourselves about the collective capitalists, about the state's capacity to function on behalf of capital's long-term interests, I think that we also need to increasingly think about environmental reform within this framework and how certain forms of changed policies around environmental issues, are going to elevate certain fractions of capital. And anyway, I just wanted to bring that into the conversation if it resonated for anyone else.
Yeah, I do think that's an important point. I'll just add too, coming at it from a different angle, that one of the things, and I don't think I have anything like a handle on this, but like the strangeness of Trump still seems to me to need more analysis as a kind of structural position insofar as, his election on some level clearly represents aspects of this kind of crisis of legitimacy of the state that some of the people who voted for him, often from various kinds of right-wing positions, but nevertheless, this kind of deep suspicion of the state and the deep state, as Trump himself calls it, Yet at the same time, what's interesting is the extent to which this kind of collective capitalist role in other ways has been able to persist. Like there was all of these arguments that Trump was going to be an authoritarian, yet he's constantly backing down on things. And yet, so he'll say something radical and then, someone will talk him out of it. So there's still these kinds of, there's this really, in the federal state right now, there's this really peculiar set of fragmentations within the power block, yet also kinds of efforts to hold it together that I think enormously complicate things in relation to the pandemic, where Trump does bizarrely seem to have had more power actually than he did in relation to other things pre-pandemic to actually set the trajectory of the state in recent weeks, especially in this kind of, just dismantling of social isolation. So yeah, I don't know that that's a helpful comment or not, but it strikes me that in thinking through this question of the collective capitalist, we have to somehow come to terms with the very bizarre set of both contingent and structural mechanisms that are at play in Trump's position in the state. And that put, state governments in the position of, in certain instances like the pandemic, trying to play a role that Trump himself is not willing to play, but that other people in other apparatuses of the federal state are clearly in certain ways trying to play. So you have this weird nexus of conflicting kinds of powers and positions.
There's a question here in the chat, which kind of circles back to this discussion we were having earlier about essential worker, but I think it kind of links up to the question of neoliberalism, actually, in a way that is being introduced by, like, what is the peculiar form of the state that Trump might be symptomatic of right now? Whether neoliberalism is adequate to describe it, which then relates to a question I have actually about the Asian developmental state, since we're talking about a different kind of coronavirus, of which there were previous episodes in the past in which there were different Asian state responses. So it's not just a question of the peculiarity of the US state or the European or state or the UK state being willing to undertake what seems to be a self-contradictory kind of economically self-contradictory kind of role, but rather also that there's the question of the Asian state and what kind of state that is. So, but the question from the chat box is, does anyone know when essential worker became human capital stock? Can the unveiling of this ideology be used for positive gains? So I think that's just a question about essential worker and human capital stock as a term. And then I have this question that I want to kind of roll onto that, which I think connects back actually to another thing that you had said, Michael, in your piece, in the written piece, about how this two-nation state, the other name for it is either authoritarian neoliberalism or the post-colonial state, right? Which, you don't get into the Asian examples, but that definitely is the thing I was thinking about in terms of Chinese governance, Hong Kong, which obviously pertains to the convenience with which the whole COVID thing has really put a stop to the umbrella movement, the Hong Kong protests, the differences between Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore is more sort of like mitigated approach rather than total suppressive approach, precisely because they already had temperature sensors installed in airports because of previous SARS episodes, because of a kind of voluntary way in which the populace will cooperate, like in Singapore, with early on with government healthcare workers stationed at every mall to take your temperature. So that everything can stay open, actually, could stay open until the second wave happened, right, with the guest workers. But for a long time, that there was mitigation as a result of very targeted, much more targeted contact tracing, right, and IDs, et cetera, so that then immediately anyone who has a temperature and then has COVID after they entered a mall, you could then track everyone else who was in the mall at that time, and they would be immediately quarantined. And so then you don't have to have a complete economic shutdown. So I don't know if you have thoughts about the question of essential worker, human capital stock forms of neoliberalism? Is that a useful term? We know people have, I Wong's written about neoliberalism as exception with regard to the Asian developmental state. How does this bring to light the differences between Asian states and Western democratic states' responses to COVID, amidst the similarities as well?
Yeah, I guess I'll take a stab at some of that with the caveat that, I'm hesitant here because although I've tried to get, I think this is an incredibly important question and some sense of its importance. I have been trying to get a clear sense of what other states, including Asian states, what kinds of approaches they've been taking to this, but I just don't have the kind of same sense of the kinds of political conversations and debates and dynamics there. I don't, for example, have a clear sense, although I'd be interested if you do have some sense, or anybody else, some sense of like whether this same kind of discourse of essential workers is playing out. It does clearly seem, from the little I know, that in some contexts, like the Chinese and like the South Korean, a certain kind of capacity of the state to do something like intensive forms of surveillance has been, as you were saying, precisely the context in which a total lockdown wasn't in most contexts, in most situations necessary. So apparently what I've read is that the South Korean state simply made it like a requirement that everyone have the equivalent of this kind of app on their phones that would keep track of who they were in contact with, so that as soon as someone was diagnosed with COVID-19, they could immediately find out all of the other people who that person had been in contact with. And so they could isolate those people and keep it from being a kind of broader outbreak. So those kinds of powers may be having something to do with the difference in from the kind of liberal rights kind of tradition in the US and the UK has been important. It is interesting too, I don't know exactly how to relate this though, India has this very different response where they just where under Modi, they just lock down everything all at once with almost no advance warning. And basically, strand hundreds of thousands of migrant workers who make up this huge proportion, informalized migrant workers who make up this huge proportion of labor in India. And so it does seem, I'm not sure I'm making a clear argument there because I fear that I don't know enough specifics to make an argument. But it does seem like these are, I guess in relation to this question of is it a neoliberal state? I'm tempted. There's this recent volume of essays called Mutant Neoliberalism, and in the introduction to that, the editors argue that what we really are seeing here is not exactly like the continuance of neoliberalism, but something like the various mutant forms that neoliberal regimes take on as they precisely try to grapple with these contradictions that neoliberal production and reproduction schemes are producing. And so perhaps the pandemic has exacerbated, in the kinds of ways I'm trying in some sense to argue in the essay, exacerbated those contradictions, and is so precisely kind of dramatizing some of the differences between these mutant forms of neoliberal statehood.
Andrew or Jason, do you have any thoughts about, is neoliberalism a useful term? Is the Trump phenomenon a sign of the end of neoliberalism or a kind of exacerbation of it? What does COVID show us about comparative neoliberalisms? Again, does anyone have a technical answer to when did essential worker become human capital stock question?
I don't know what that, I'm not entirely sure what that's referring to.
I think that's a reference to Trump, one of Trump's economic advisors, maybe he holds a more formal position in the state. I think it was earlier today, referred to how he was optimistic about the economy because our capital stock was strong and our human capital stock was ready to go.
Oh, I think I remember. Okay, right.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's not in the discourse per se. It's some bozo in the administration saying things off the cuff, I suppose. Yeah, I don't have a great deal just I mean, authoritative in any case to say about this question, particularly the Asian developmental state. But I do think that it's, I mean, on the one hand, the way in which the Trump administration has sort of antagonized China in particular before the COVID crisis, I guess in the interest of ultimately of sort of reshoring some of the supply chains that had been kind of extended over the course of the so-called neoliberal period, how that fits in to that kind of prior dynamic is really, really interesting to me. I don't know if that envelops the entire kind of, as you call it, the Asian developmental state. I mean, certainly South Korea, I think, has been pointed out by some as a kind of interesting, like, success story. I think there's been like 250 deaths or something like that. I mean, it's really quite minimal. And I think that the usual American response is some kind of self-congratulatory, well, you know, we have our messy freedoms, that, you know, they can do that there, but of course we're kind of, you know, whatever, kind of free liberal subjects, and therefore there's death and destruction everywhere. I don't know if that's the kind of ideological, like, sort of starting point for responding to those different ways in which different types of states or different kind of situations, because as you point out, I mean, the previous SARS epidemic obviously made it such that they were ready for this kind of situation in a way that the US was not. But yeah, for me, the question is, like, how does the sort of anti-China, and really in the most base and crude form, racist forms that Trump, you know, speaks publicly in terms, the terms that he speaks of it in public, how does the COVID crisis play out in the context of that larger geopolitical dynamic, which I think everyone assumes it has a kind of scale that's really, really important in terms of a kind of declining hegemon in the figure of the US and a kind of emerging or ascending hegemon in the figure of China. So I don't know. I just, my sense is really that the American response would be, well, you know, that's good for them, but not for us. So, and it's, again, it's a self-congratulatory gesture, even as the incompetence and devastation mounts everywhere. So,
Andrew, any last words? We're coming up on our time limit.
No, I think, you know, I also don't have too much to add on that question, unfortunately. So I'll defer.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. I thought that was a great discussion. I think Philip's back to wrap it up.
Hey, that was terrific. And you're right, it was a great discussion. And thank you, Michael, Jason, and Andrew, and Colleen for doing a wonderful job moderating. I would like to say that tomorrow we have 2 events not to be missed. One, the post-pandemic condition from 5 philosophers at 1 o'clock. And we also have at 6 o'clock, I believe, the neoliberal city after the plague. There's a subtle allusion there to Daniel Defoe. I'm sure you've all picked it up. But anyway, thanks a lot for sitting in tonight. And I guess all I'll say is we need that money to start rolling in at a faster rate. So if you can go to www.redmayseattle.org and spare us any kind of small dollar donation, click on donate, that would be great. You can do it on our YouTube page. And also subscribe to our YouTube page so we can have live CC captioning for the differently abled. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow.